Warning, this video contains spoilers for Star Trek Discovery Season 1 and Star Trek Discovery Season 2. Star Trek Discovery Season 2, Episode 8, If Memory Serves. This is it. This is peak performance for a Star Trek episode. We had well-connected stories, breathtaking visuals, intriguing mysteries, and emotional performances. All of the previous complaints I levied against the show, specifically about resolving some of our character-related plots, have all come to a head, and boy did it pay off. This entire episode is extremely lean, with every frame and sequence being packed full of information. So much so that I'm going to have to break each story thread up individually to help ensure I cover each one correctly. Let's get into it. Let's start off with Pike. This episode kicks off with an amazing Last Time on Star Trek introduction, which sets up Pike and Spock's previous mission to Talos 4. Doing this was a smart way to connect the show back to the original series in a very literal way, while also laying the groundwork for his emotional connection to Vina, the human who is a permanent resident on the planet of Talos. The two sequences shared between Pike and her carry with it an enormous amount of weight. Honestly, the brilliant acting of Anson Mount and Melissa George not only pay respect to the performances we saw in the original series, but even go so far as to elevate it to another level. I especially liked how it also set up Pike's desire to eventually return to Talos 4 after his accident. Now let's get into Ash and Pike. Continuing from the previous episode, the relationship between these two men seems to be getting better, if only slightly. Both of them still seem at odds with how to handle the Burnham-Spock situation, but it's much less hostile than in previous episodes. However, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there is still some tension between them. I cracked on the episode last week for being a little too hokey with their conflict resolution, when in reality, it wasn't really resolved at all. Ash being so pro-Section 31 and seemingly acting like a roadblock for Discovery makes it much easier for the crew to believe he was responsible for sending secret messages off the ship and sabotaging the spore drive. And that brings us to the next plot thread, Arium. It's clear she's up to no good throughout the entire episode. She seems to be hovering around important conversations a lot more than usual, corrupting the ship's systems, framing Ash for sending off massive amounts of data to an unknown source, and having crippled the spore drive. Based off of the previews for the next week's episode, it seems as though her subterfuge is discovered and a confrontation takes place. But, as of now, I'm not sure what the ultimate goal is other than operating as a spy and stealing massive amounts of Federation data. On a related note, the alien probe from last week's episode wasn't able to be recovered. There were 0 debris left over from the explosion for some reason. Next up, I want to talk about Stamets and Cobra. I whined last week that the Cobra subplot wasn't getting enough attention, and I just assumed someone at CBS watched that video and decided to bitch slap me with some great content. While Cobra is still reeling from being brought back from the dead and unsure of who he is now, we see Stamets desperately trying to reconnect with the man that he loves and lost. I found myself angry with how much Stamets was pushing Cobra, especially during the dinner sequence. But I suppose that's kind of the point. Cobra needs his space, and we as the viewer can objectively understand that. However, Stamets isn't processing his own emotions correctly, and is leading down his own path of unhealthy behaviors. These are some serious emotional subjects being broached here. And as if the emotional turmoil wasn't enough, we see a physical confrontation happen between Ash and Cobra in the mess hall. Again, something that I have been wondering about for weeks is finally happening, and boy does it deliver.
Round 1, fight!
While the fight itself was an emotionally cathartic event for the two of them, they also shared a touching moment at the end when I think Cobra realized that he and Ash might have more in common than he originally thought. Both men are so unsure of who they are right now and ultimately feel lost and sad. The next plot point we need to discuss is Section 31. We are getting to see more and more of this organization than we ever have before. And while that may upset a lot of Trekkies, I will remind you that this show takes place over 100 years before Deep Space Nine. It's possible their methodology shifted through time. In fact, it's possible that Leland gets booted out by the Admiralty for his failures, and Georgiou takes command of the entire division and makes it even more obscure than it ever has been before. At this point, it doesn't seem like Section 31 is as off the books as we were led to believe in Deep Space Nine. Again, that could be a consequence of a rewrite, or changing operational tendencies, or that Starfleet does have its hands a lot dirtier than we originally thought. Georgiou has pretty much had the upper hand on Leland for the entire season so far. However, I am interested to see if the tables turn at some point. Perhaps this would be a moment where Michael needs to come and save her from a bad situation. Regardless, we are now going to see Section 31 hunting down the Discovery for failing to follow orders and helping to save Spock and Michael. Speaking of which, let's dig into the biggest arc of this entire episode, Michael and Spock.
The Starfleet Manual offers no regulatory guidelines for interactions between humans with Klingons grafted to their bones and a ship's doctor returned from the dead.
There's a lot to unpack here with these two, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I possibly can. After arriving on Talos 4, Michael and Spock are greeted by Vera and the Talosians. Desperate to help save her brother's mind, Michael agrees to let the Talosians view her memory of the damaging event between the siblings all of those years ago. With the deal struck, Michael gets a view into the information traveling through Spock's mind that was fed to him by the Red Angel. We'll get back to what she saw in a minute. I really love the dynamic between brother and sister here. Oddly enough, Michael always comes off as distant and kind of cold at times during the Discovery, but her interaction with Spock really showed off a new side of her. His ultra-stoic personality made her seem fun by comparison, but in a good way.
If I knew we would not be here,
I was asking rhetorically.
then at least ask something I've never asked of myself.
Can we have a better version of this conversation?
Is there a valuable question in your arsenal?
Yes, do you actually think the beard is working?
The playful banter was nice, also constantly shifting tones to keep us on our emotional toes about what would happen next. Eventually, this peaked at the end of the episode when we are treated to the flashback we've been teased all season, and it didn't disappoint.
I love you.
Love? You're not capable of love.
I am.
No, you are not. You are Vulcan. And you will always be cold and distant, like a moon somewhere.
Not only was this an emotionally powerful moment in the series, the production of such a sequence must have been nearly impossible to complete. The constantly shifting camera angles, cycling back and forth between the younger and older versions of Spock and Michael, interchanging the voices of the actors, all worked spectacularly. I really felt an emotional hit here, especially when it was older Burnham yelling at young Spock. This scene is going to be in a lot of top 5 or top 10 lists for greatest scenes in Star Trek, mark my words. And now finally, let's talk about the Red Angel plotline. So we see that Spock was able to mind meld with the Angel, and by doing so, he was shown a future where all sentient life was wiped out in the universe. The culprits being these weird-looking ships that resemble the probe from the previous episode. Spock also reveals that the Red Angel is a human who is feeling lost and desperate. Additionally, as we theorized in my last week video regarding the Red Angel's intentions, this being did come back in time to explicitly save Michael Burnham from getting killed on Vulcan. In fact, Spock was even shown a possible future in which she doesn't even exist. It's still unclear what this Angel's full intentions are, but it would seem to me that in a last-ditch effort to save sentient life, a human built a temporal suit and has begun making small timeline changes in order to prevent this catastrophe, starting with the Church in World War III, to Michael Burnham, and even the Spore Drive. I don't find it a coincidence that Arium's first order of business, being under the influence of this other future faction, was to sabotage the Spore Drive interface, a technology that could potentially have been used to stop the coming calamity. Overall, this episode was fantastic. I literally have no negative things to say. The only downside to something amazing like this is that the bar is potentially getting set too high. But this entire season has been almost one giant surprise after another, and I really look forward to seeing where this plotline takes us.